Would you want to know the phone numbers of all the police officers in your country? And also everybody they talk to, such as the DA, lawyers, witnesses, maybe even anonymous witnesses? Well, let's find out. Welcome to Threat Talks. My name is Lieuwe Jan Koning, and from headquarters here at ON2IT, we bring you Threat Talks, the deep dive. And the subject of today is the law enforcement breach. Let's get on to it.
Welcome to Threat Talks. Let's delve deep into the dynamic world of cybersecurity.
Let me start by introducing our guests of today. Jeroen Scheerder, he is a security specialist, everything, and also number 0 employee of ON2IT. I worked with him for a very long time. And Rob Maas, he's the field CTO of ON2IT. Gentlemen, welcome. This country I was talking about is the Netherlands. It's Dutch law enforcement that we're talking about. Jeroen, can you enlighten me? What happened?
Well, sometime shortly before September 27, there was an incident. Somehow, contact data and some details of message exchanged became public. And it turned out there was a breach with one law enforcement employee that led to the exposure of contact data in general, his own address book or her own address book, I don't know. And of course, the global address book from this organization being the Dutch police. That contained not just details on police employees, but also relations. And the conversations, the communications, of course, entailed details of ongoing matters.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds like that someone's email box with all their contacts is being compromised.
That's exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Their contacts and the global contact lists of the police organization.
And how global is that?
All employees.
All employees.
And a class of relations.
Hmm.
Meaning attorneys, prosecutors, and maybe even so-called expert witnesses that partake as forensic experts, for example, in the court of law.
Mm-hmm. Do we know what happened? How it happened?
There has been a stunning lack of transparency in the post-mortem. There may or may not have been executed one, but the level of detail that's been made public told us that it started with a breach of a single account in which a so-called session cookie was compromised, which could then be reused by the adversary, the attacker, to take over that user's session. And this concerned an Outlook web session. And that exposed, of course, the full communications of that person at the address book and so on.
Yeah, maybe Robert should explain a little bit how this works, because session cookie, that's the thing. I mean, first of all, you always have authentication, right? And that could be multi-factor.
That could be multi-factor, of course, but that doesn't matter.
No, indeed, because then, I mean, it's not like every click you do on in a webmail client, then you have to authenticate again with multi-factor.
Exactly.
There's a thing called a session cookie that's constantly going back and forth.
Yeah. What we do to prevent that, you have to log on every time again, and that's get annoying. We store a session cookie, so you log into a system, and then to prevent it, you have to log in again. A session cookie is being stored with a session key normally, and that's being used to authenticate you again on the back end to see if you still have a valid session going on. And that's exactly what happened here. That cookie that contains the session, that can be, in this case at least, could be easily transferred to another machine and then being used.
Yeah, so you get it out of the browser store, or how does that? Do we know how this happened in this case?
This has not been disclosed, but it can happen in a multiple of ways. These session cookies do get stored in caches locally on systems, but they're of course also exchanged in transit. So it can either be malware infection that could access that local storage, or it could have been intercepted in transit, for example, by a man-in-the-middle attack, which is what you would typically have if you had a phishing, a successful phishing exploit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we're talking about Outlook Web Access or some kind of Office 365 or whatever, probably.
Yes.
And that's probably in SSL. So there's a couple of things you need to do. You need to make sure that the cookie is only allowed over SSL. You need to make the cookie HTTP only. There's a couple of technical requirements, but weren't those taken then? Maybe we don't know.
Basically, we don't know. But even the mere fact of the thing not being exposed in the clear because you have an SSL, that does not stop man-in-the-middle attackers. You can fake a site and it can have a legitimate SSL certificate. And most users do not pay attention to detail, and they are not triggered by alarms because in the end, the attacker can whip up a valid SSL site that looks just like the authentication site normally used. It can be a replica.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I don't think that is necessarily detected at the user level.
Mm-hmm.
And the mechanism that you're implying basically are restricted to SSL sessions and this session only and so forth. That would still work when proxied by an attacker.
Yeah, okay, but then Rob, it's weird that this person is in a different country maybe, or and nicking it. It's in my browser. Why would that work in another person's browser? This is a problem that has been solved.
Yes, it has been, and we even saw it before with Okta and 1Password. At least 1Password noticed that Okta had some problems, and it was almost the same. The session cookie could be copied to a different machine, and then from a different location, different machine, they could log into Okta. And the same happens here. There is no check if the session cookie is being used on a different system or a different IP address. And Okta has solved this, for example, by making sure that the IP address, the source IP address, is being checked if the session cookie is used again. And if that doesn't match it, you have to re-authenticate. So there are mechanisms that can easily detect this kind of
Now, I would say that many people who choose for a huge company like Microsoft assume that this is all mandatory default.
Yeah, well, relying on the default is always a challenge. We have had a lot of sessions about that. So you should check indeed what kind of measures you can take. There are a lot of things you can do. I don't know all the details in depth on Microsoft 365 or in this case Exchange Online probably. But even then, if Microsoft cannot do it, you can do it yourself with putting a proxy in between that solved this authentication issue for you.
Mm-hmm.
So there are multiple ways to cope with this. And then I think the first question, and especially in this case, because I think this attack is more severe than at least they brought out to the media, is should Outlook Web Access even be open to the public internet, especially if you know there are these kinds of toxic details within the system. You can use a VPN before it. Maybe Outlook Web Access is not necessary at all, because at least in my experience, most people will use a local email client. So there are a lot of things to discuss if this should be open.
I'm actually, these could be matters of national security also. I'm actually a bit surprised that they would use Office 365 for this. Honestly,
Yeah.
The safe harbor isn't really a thing.
That is actually a bit strange, especially in view of the fact that we do have a government policy in place that actually compels organizations to use open source solutions by default, and the policy is called Employer Explain. Dus
So you either do it,
toepassen of uitleggen. And as far as I know, that didn't happen. So I think we do have a procurement issue there, because I would say that the adaptation of this technology in view of such a delicate matter should never be an automatic reflex.
Yeah,
that explanation should really be there.
Yeah,
and if you do something that is so risky, because this software of course has a very poor track record, especially then you should put measures in place, much like Rob had. You put a VPN in front. You
because
put a
you can
proxy in front.
enforce Outlook Web Access to only allow connections from certain IP or with certain header that you can only insert from your own infrastructure, for example.
And of course, you can reflect upon your own process. There is no reason to have web access at all, because you do have clients which run in a more or less controlled environment. And this includes mobile, by the way. So there is really no barrier there that forces you to do the web thing.
Yeah.
Not for something so as old and established as a mail facility is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
why is this whole address book? I mean, if there's so many sensitive contacts in an address, why would you put them in an address book? Should you also reconsider that, or is that unavoidable in an organization like that?
No, it's a choice, and it's also a sort of inherent in the Outlook design that it's done that way. There are basically two ways of doing easy address access in contacts, and that is, for example, what's pretty common is that you know someone's name, you start typing, and your software has ways to complete that or suggests addresses. That's one way, and if you do this, you just integrate with the so-called directory service, and you don't need to store a list on your system. But that's not what happens. You do store a list, and it gets pushed.
Yeah. So if your contacts are primary citizens in terms of data, then make sure that you think about it more properly.
Yes.
Yeah. What was the response of the organization of the law enforcement?
The first response was really bad, in my opinion. They blamed the interim or a volunteer. They said, okay, they didn't pay attention, which I think as an organization you should never do. You should be open about what happened. I think that's good. But don't blame anyone. It also fosters a culture of.
We recently had a thread talk about that with Fleur, about the tendency to blame, to have scapegoats.
And that's scapegoating is a poor response, because even if it is an individual person doing something bad, that still means your stuff is just broken. Because if a single person can do that, then you're vulnerable.
Yeah. She also raised the question on LinkedIn that it was really a bad behavior to point to the volunteer in this case, or the interim, which raised a lot of or at least lead to a lot of discussion. And I think it's really a bad thing to do.
What would you advise any CISO or any organization if they get breached to how you would communicate?
At least be transparent, say what happened. Of course, within the scope that you don't inform the adversary too much, but at least be open. Especially in this case, it's national system, or at least national data that's being leaked. So be also.
But I can imagine. Suppose they wouldn't have had their MFA would have been malfunctioned and hasn't been fixed yet. You're not going to say, an hour after the breach, we noticed what it was wrong. MFA was disabled. Not in this case, probably.
But even then, if you're transparent, you can always say, okay, this is what we have learned and this is what we have improved. And now now it's being a bit downplayed, and we don't want to open it because we think it's a nation state actor. Maybe it is. We don't know. But it was a really simple attack. So
we saw three things in the response. One was scapegoating, and the other was downplaying it. No, it was a limited breach and no serious information. And then, of course, it turned out to be otherwise. And the third thing is, this is very sophisticated. And on all three counts, I think there is reason not much reason to believe that it's actually the case. And this is bad, of course. A good response would be to embrace what's happened and to be honest about it, because as it happened here, you don't get the troubles once, you get them 4 times over, because every time it turns out that you've been dishonest about what actually happened, it's a new incident again, right? It's a new
organization doesn't learn, probably. Well, we don't know what happens under the hood, of course, but
yes, but of course, one incident means you get blemished once, and you can make it into 6. That's easy.
Yeah.
And that's what they did, of course. And even now, I would say there has been a lack of transparency as to the actual root cause. a lack of transparency in the follow-up. What did they do to mitigate that? We know that very sensitive individual information details were exposed. Were these people informed? Were they protected?
We don't know.
We don't know. And of course, it's pretty hard to just pluck 65,000 new identities out of thin air.
Yeah.
I mean, but that is the potential extent of such a breach. And even the 65,000 may be downplayed.
Yeah, but maybe you could argue this is in the interest of national security to be vague about this.
No, I don't think so. What happened. The information is out there. The thing that you need to do for national security is have a strong answer and not an evasion. And what we've seen is evasions.
Yeah, because now the bad guys have the data,
of course,
but the good guys don't. I mean, or they don't even know what the data.
And you mentioned reflection, and I think the overselling this as a nation-state attack. Well, it may be true, but we've not seen the evidence of this. And in the anatomy of the attack, obtaining a session key and reusing it is kids' stuff. If that's a nation state, then it's Andorra.
Look it up on Google Maps how big it is.
And I don't mean to put down Andorra here. It's a very capable country with lots of financial institutions and so on. So it's probably
Vatican City
below their pay grade. Liechtenstein.
Yeah.
No, also not. Okay.
But your point is it doesn't smell like a very sophisticated attack. Maybe them getting access to a system from which they then did, but maybe they used a very difficult technique that we don't know of. But it could have been with in a simple way, because in the end, Office 365 was simply misconfigured, or at least not properly done enough. Right?
It was a poor choice to start with. It was not properly hardened. And I think it's a bit too easy to pass off your own stupidity as a nation-state attack, because this is just lacking. Even if it is a nation-state, by the way, then it's still lacking to do it this way.
Is there a way? Does this get a follow-up, maybe lawsuits or so, or stuff in Parliament? Questions in Parliament, that kind of stuff. Is that happening? Will that happen? What do you think?
No, the minister basically said it was a nation-state attack, and due to the severity of the data, there is no further disclosure of what happened and what we will do. So it's really downplayed, non-transparent,
and including the follow-ups. All right. So the process of reflection and the extent of mitigation, we know nothing.
Okay. What if it was our own organization or any other organization? How should you respond?
Yeah, like Jeroen said, embrace it, learn from it, be open about it to a certain extent, of course, and show what you have done to improve it and to overcome these kinds of incidents. And I think we have enough organizations. We mentioned Okta already in this talk, but you can see exactly what they have done. What happened, what they have done to improve it, and what they have learned from it. And I think that's the way it should be.
And don't scapegoat.
Never scapegoat, no.
Well, on that conclusion, gentlemen, thank you very much for those insights. I hope it gets people to think on and also set up a communication strategy or practice having breached and do it the proper way then. Thanks a lot. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in to Threat Talks this time. If you like what you saw today, please like us. It helps us spread the word. And you can also subscribe to our channel while you're there, because that makes sure that next week you will have yet another episode of Threat Talks in your inbox. Feedback, please email us at team@threat-talks.com or leave something in the comments. And we also have all kinds of material available in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. That leaves me saying goodbye to you. Thank you very much and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Threat Talks, a podcast by ON2IT Cybersecurity and AMSIX. Did you like what you heard? Do you want to learn more? Follow Threat Talks to stay up to date on the topic of cybersecurity.